Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's plant clinic. I'm just going to take a minute here while everybody gets logged in to review a couple of things for anybody who's attending for the first time. If you are attending the virtual plant clinic for the first time, welcome. We're glad to have you. Just a couple of notes. This is a Zoom webinar, so it's a little bit different than meetings. If you have questions during the class, you're going to type those questions into the chat box or the Q&A. I'll be monitoring those, and David has a couple of points during the presentation where he will be taking questions from you. We are recording today, so usually about 24 hours after the class, you can go to our YouTube channel and access the virtual plant clinic if you want to watch it again or share it with friends. Any reason you need to access it again, you can go on there in about 24 hours and access that recording. And I think for our virtual plant clinic, that's about it for me. I feel like I'm forgetting something, David, but I don't think I am. I'll hand it on over to you. And if anybody has any issues, please just send me a chat, like tech issues, send me a chat, send me an email. I'll be monitoring that as well. Thanks. All right. Go ahead, David. You can
All
start.
right, thanks, Sally, and thank you everybody for joining us. It's been nice. I've had a chance to meet several of you at the garden center. I guess now that the weather's nicer and everybody's coming out of hiding and doing some planting, it's been great meeting with you. It's kind of interesting, this virtual plant clinic we started, I think about 3 years ago or something, Sally, and we never done anything like that. So I picked 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoons because that's what was most convenient for me. That's kind of a weird time, but that works into my schedule. We got backup help. I can get away from the store for a little bit, that kind of things. So it's been really gratifying to know that several of you have become kind of regular viewers coming in. Nice to meet you. And yes, the garden center looks fantastic. I just went out and grabbed a little bit of early spring color to brighten things up. So definitely come by and check things out. So a lot of my conversations the past couple weeks, past few weeks, I'll even say, have been around soil. I think this makes perfectly good sense because as we think about what we want to plant, we're considering adding new plants and talking about what we can do to get the soil prepared, talking about expanding beds, opening up new areas of the garden, talking about soil, people building raised gardens. But as we go into the planting season, I've just had one question after another about soil, and there's a lot of ideas, opinions, different approaches out there. And I thought, hey, this would be a really good topic for us to talk about. So the first part of my presentation here is I'm going to be talking about soil, different conditioners, a little bit about what defines and makes good soil. I'll take a short break there. Hopefully, if you have any questions pertaining to that part of it, we'll discuss that. Make sure we're kind of all on the same page, good understanding from there. Then the second half of it, I'm going to delve into more detail on soil chemistry, particularly about fertilizers, what they are, what they're not, how to use them, that kind of thing. And then we should have some time for additional questions at the end. But you put all that together, and it adds up to quite a bit of stuff. It may not be beautiful. That's why I surround myself with the flowers, but it's critical, it's important, and like I say, we get tons of questions about that. So I'm just going to jump right into this with a few slides. Okay, so I start out here what I call growing good soil, because one of the things I like to emphasize is soil takes time to develop. It's not something that's instant. And even if you come in and you just purchase a bag of soil or buy it in bulk by cubic yards of soil, a lot of times that's a really good beginning, but it, in my mind, hasn't really developed its full character that it takes to develop what I'm going to call a good soil. And when we talk about a good soil, this might mean different things to different people, but I think we inherently know that what we're looking for is something that has this dark, rich, organic uh, color to it, has a nice structure to it, feels good in our hands, actually even sort of smells good. So it's one of these things that you may not be able to define it, but you know it when you see it, that's out there. So that's where I say talk about growing good soil, and I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about what that means to me, and even more specifically, what it means to your plants. So if I'm drilling down, just specifically talking about relationship between plants and soil, because there's soil that goes from an engineering perspective. The way engineers look at soil is a completely different view, total opposite view of a lot of times what we as gardeners or farmers might be looking at as a soil. But when I talk about relationship between plants and soil, it's, as we say in this little definition there about, it's crucial for plant growth. The soil is providing one, physical support, right? Plants, they have this root system, at least terrestrial plants. I'm not talking aquatic plants or epiphytes or anything, but terrestrial plants, their roots sink down into the ground, and that's what anchors and supports them as they grow up in height. I think that's one of the real interesting ideas, or you go out there as you start looking about, well, where did plants come from? And you go back a way millennium ago, I mean, eons, epochs ago, billions of years ago, plants came out of the water and making their way up on the ground. It was actually developing a root system and developing soils that allowed them to continue to grow and evolve to what we see today. So they need a physical place to support and anchor themselves in there. The soil also then becomes their source of water, because your soil is going to hold water in the pore space, and then that's where the plants are absorbing it through their root system. That's also where the roots are going to get the minerals, the nutrients they need to live and grow. The plant roots also need oxygen for respiration that's down there. So their whole existence exists below ground, where they're dependent on the conditions to get the proper balance of oxygen, water, nutrients, and enough soil, enough support to hold them upright. It's a mutualistic or reciprocal kind of a relationship that's there, because at the same time, the plants are building and improving soils. Because as the plants in turn grow and die and their organic matter goes into the soil, that helps to improve the structure. It helps feed the microorganisms there and there. Plants help to protect and hold the soil in place to prevent it from eroding. So it's a really kind of cool relationship between both the plants and the soil, where the plants depend on the soil for the proper growing environment, and the plants in return are actually building and improving the soil over years. So again, this is a very, very slow process that occurs during geologic timeframes. The picture I show here was a subdivision, new housing development that's going in pretty near my home where I live. And these were planting holes. So this was a development, had several, I want to say they $1.5 to $2 million, sort of typical homes that we find here in Northern Virginia. But anyway, yeah, really big, nice, beautiful homes. But this was the soil that they were planting boxwoods into, because I wanted to watch and see what happens here. So what ends up happening, this is an urban soil. This is after the construction. You can see it's got rocks, stone, debris, different types, colors mixed in there. It's compacted down. They dug out little holes that were barely big enough to squeeze the plants into, throw them in, and top mulch over. This, I am sad to say, and everybody knows this, this is pretty typical. This is what is kind of the normal process for new construction, new development in our urban areas. And then we cram a plant in there and expect it to live, grow, and thrive. All these boxwoods died, and if you go by there, that was pretty much predictable when you look at it in here, especially when you don't provide any water for them. But then they came back and they've been replaced with some Globe arborvitae, which seem to be surviving. So somebody's giving them a little bit of TLC. But oftentimes, this is what we start with. We know it's not what our plants want. It's not what we want. And most of my conversation is going to be talking about how do we get from this condition to an environment that will actually allow plants to grow and thrive. So if you look at the components of soil, essentially, I keep saying soil develops over time. So think about old mountainous areas, and erosion from wind, rain, water, all these erosion type practices taking place over time, over eons of time. And then all that rock and mineral material breaks down to smaller and smaller sizes. So when we talk about soil, the largest particle in there would be sand. And everybody kind of has an understanding of how small sand is. So a lot of this is based on the size of the particles in there. And if sand and gravel, you can see they're sort of 2 millimeters or larger. Sand, the next size down. When you start getting to silt, we're talking now microscopic in size. And we get to clay, we're talking about scanning electron microscope size. So where we live is very old geologically, and the soil that was once ancient ocean bottoms and also had risen up in the mountains and been worn by erosion over the eons of time, it breaks down into smaller and smaller and smaller particles. This also changes not just the physical properties, not just the size, but this also starts to influence the chemical properties of it. So where we live, we tend to be basically in highly eroded old soil that has a very high percentage of clay. And it's these little tiny small particles that then can get compacted down to the point where it's very hard, very dense, difficult for air and water to move through it. And we get this kind of look at how they are arranged. So if I looked up here, what I call a granular soil structure, this is what we want. Soil scientist instructor once told me, he said, think of a bowl of grape nuts, grape nut cereal. I think that's a really good image for me. And what I have is within this bowl of cereal, or that's my analogy, it's supposed to be the soil. What would happen is if rain comes in, it's porous, it allows water and air to move through that, penetrate through. And so you see water entering in, water draining out. Within that pore space, this area between the soil particles, that's where the minerals are available to the roots. They're soluble, the plant can absorb it. Some of that would be airspace, some of it would be water, and life would be grand. So that's what we would like to. If we look at over here in this side of the chart, this is unfortunately where we find ourselves because of the composition of our soil, the parent material that's there, the age of it, and I think even more so just the construction activity, the urban activity. What we end up with is a very dense, very compact, very heavy soil, and water is very difficult to penetrate in there. There's really very little pore space that allows for air, water, moisture holding capacity. And sometimes it gets so rock hard that it's even difficult and a challenge for roots to move within it. So ultimately, I'm saying this is kind of where we end up, where we have water going in, but very little coming out, much of that running off. What we really want to be is over on this side of the chart, right? So we're talking about the physical composition, what actually goes into and comprises and makes up that soil. And what are we going to do to make it better? Well, you can see right here, these are the some of the boxwood gardens at Mount Vernon Estate. They have to follow George Washington's schedule, of course, or his design ideas. And what happened here, this several years ago, over the years, the boxwood garden had failed. And one by one, these boxwoods started going to decline, die, and it was time to rejuvenate, renew the garden. So the boxwoods were removed, pulled out, and replanted. The replacement plants, then they went into decline, died, and I think it was necessary to do it another time, a second time they came in and replaced the replacements. Those plants died. What was happening is basically because of the soil composition. It's this dense clay soil, not draining well, not providing the right root environment for it. And so as a remedy to that, they came in and they mixed, this is a material that's called permatil. So this is shale. It's a stone, totally natural stone that's excavated and mined down in the, I think, North Carolina, but then it's put into a kiln at very high temperatures, and it fractures it and breaks it up into this gravel-like structure. And if you were to look at it closely, it has this little tiny pore space within here, almost like lava rock, you might say. And I think by adding that in there, what it does is it's really holding some airspace, increasing the porosity and increasing the drainage within there. So this is what we talk about. This is sort of changing the soil texture. If I was to look at that and say, okay, hey, the problem is I have too much clay and not enough pore space. So a lot of times people will start to add sand, for example. Sand does open up the soil and helps to enhance the drainage and the airspace that's in there, but it needs to be at levels of like 70% or more sand. You have to use a lot of it to actually change the composition of the soil. USGA golf green is 90% sand. So when we start putting things like this permatil, where we're trying to change the composition of the soil, oftentimes we have to do it in such large volumes, it doesn't work. It may work for you in a small limited space like a raised bed or just a small garden area or growing in pots and containers, but on a large scale, changing the soil texture by trying to change the composition of the material is generally just a difficult, challenging, not real practical way to do it. So what I recommend, really the best way to get from crummy soil to good soil is by not changing the composition, but actually sort of feeding the soil. Within the soil, there's a whole world of life down there. It's life that we are somewhat unaware of, and a lot of it we can't see, but it is there. If you were to follow my little pyramid here, what you might see, right? We've all seen birds out in the garden. So a bird that might be out there feeding on worms that are down the soil. And you might have worms that are going through feeding on decaying organic matter in the ground. You might run into things like, millipedes and things like that. A lot of this level, these are oftentimes what we call shredders. They're eating decomposed organic matter. So if a leaf falls to the ground, they're chewing on it. There are sometimes predators feeding on each other. This level down here to about springtails and maybe even mites, you may be able to visually see that, right? So as we go down kind of in this sort of trophic levels here, you see the smaller the organisms get, the more abundant they come in numbers. And then when we get down here into sort of the nematodes, the protozoa, and down here into the bacteria, actinomycetes, fungal organisms, this is where the real action takes place. If we say, hey, there's roughly 1.5 million type species of fungi that exist in the world, and we've identified only 100,000 of them, we barely scratched the surface on there. But what's happening is all this life, all this soil life that's going on in here, it basically, they're eating organic matter, they're eating each other. What they're doing, they're feeding off of dead, dying plant roots. And that's why I'm saying how the plants in turn build the soil, because the plants and all the organic matter, it's feeding the microorganisms. The microorganisms in turn are what is changing and improving the soil structure and composition that's out there. So trying to summarize a little bit, some additives, things like perlite, vermiculite, like talked about the permatil, sand, those are attempts to change the soil texture. I'm trying to add more stuff to change the composition of the soils there. And we can do that, but it's kind of on a small, limited basis. A lot of times it just gets to where it's just not practical in terms of cost and materials that go into it. But if I'm saying like a soil needs to be 70% sand or something to be good, the organic material, really a healthy soil is going to be around 3 to 5%. So when I talk about a soil conditioner, or I talk about feeding the soil, these are different composts, different organic matter that in there. Soil conditioners contain carbon, right? And all the worms and fungi and nematodes and all that life that's in the soil basically needs carbon to live. So that's the food source. So when we put these together, and there's many, many different choices are out there. This could be like our Merrifield planting mix is one that we've custom formulated. It's a very good product. can really use to any kind of planting, but we sort of had in mind trees, shrubs, flowers, sort of landscape type work. So when you look in here, what's in that? That's basically it's aged bark, it's mushroom compost, it's coconut coir, pine fines. There's a little bit of limestone in there to balance out. There's also an organic nutrient supplement in there. But essentially what we're doing with this is we're really not feeding the plants. We're feeding all the life that's in the soil. And in turn, that over time is what's building and improving our soil, the structure of it, getting better conditions for air and water to move forward, better conditions for root, and adding nutrients. While we carry many of them, I wanted to show you one other, just as another favorite of mine. I tend to go with bumper crop. It's a little bit targeted towards growing vegetables. You can really use it in any kind of gardening. These products are somewhat interchangeable. But when you look at the bumper crop, worm castings, lobster and crab shells, kelp meal, aged bark, you can read the list that's in there. So they've taken several different really great organic ingredients, mixed it together. This is a certified organic product. So sometimes if that's important to you, then that's something that we could do within there. So again, that's what I'm saying. Soil conditioners are going to have the carbon that's in there. And there's many of them to choose from. One last slide, and then I'll try and keep myself on schedule, take a break. So this is what I'm saying, not changing the texture of the composition, but by adding these organic products to it, we're putting carbon in there. The carbon enriches the biology, the fungal organisms, the bacterial organisms, the plant itself start to bind these particles together for better structure, better aeration, better moisture holding capacity. So basically any type of soil, I'm going to say compost is a solution to it. Compost also decomposes over time. Like I said, it is a process that takes time. So it's something we should replenish whenever we have the opportunity. Every time I'm putting new plants in or creating a new bed, routinely top dressing, always a good thing to put in there. So I'm going to stop talking for just a second here, see if we have any questions. And then after this, we'll move in and talk about fertilizers and exactly how they fit into the picture.
Yeah, so I'm just going to say we have a question that came in about seed starting. So for now, we'll hold that until towards the end, since that's a little off topic, but it's fine. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and submit them now. Is shredded bark a helpful way to replenish soil?
Yes, that's the short answer. Now, what will happen is sometimes bark products, like even a lot of times we use them in mulch, they're going to be slower to break down, particularly if you think of the bark that comes off of a tree. It contains lignin. It's got waxes that are naturally water and decay resistant. So a lot of times we use those as a mulch on the cover of the soil to protect it. It can be mixed in the soil, but if you're doing this, you'll just notice its decomposition is slower over a longer period of time, but it does add the organic matter to the soil. We use that in some of our planting mix, as you saw, because we also think sometimes the chunkier texture of it kind of also helps in breaking up some of the soil and creating air passageways in it. So all these different composts, they have their sort of pros and cons, but yes, aged or shredded bark is certainly a good choice to put into the ground.
Okay. All right. Here's our next question. I compost and wondered if that would work in place of these soil conditioners.
100% you should be composting, and we're talking about the same thing. If I just use this generic term and said compost, all these products that I've talked about, they are just different compost materials. So whether I'm composting leaves, grass clippings, tree branches, waste from the seafood industry, manure, these are all composted products that we can use. They do have sort of different characteristics with them. And so you might say, well, this one's got more nutrients, this one breaks down faster, a lot of different qualities to go with it. That's one of the reasons I'm going to say I prefer the blended products. So that's where you see things like bumper crop or the Merrifield planting mix. We're not taking one source. we're taking several sources and mixing it together. I did this little thing. I don't even know if it's going to show. It's not as dramatic as I'd hope, but this soil that I'm touching right in here, that's a part of my garden bed that I have been amending and adding compost to occasionally, a little at a time. And I do my own composting. This is everything, kitchen scraps and a little bit of yard waste going in. I've been amending the soil here. This is sort of the native, undisturbed, untouched soil that's just 5 feet over. So the difference between these two is this one, I've been building the organic matter with compost. See, it's got a nice structure to it. It's got that crumb-like structure that's going on there, a little darker in color, better water holding capacity. That's one of the reasons this one looks so dry and everything is because this structure just isn't there. It's not absorbing and holding water quite as well. So that's with and that's without. And again, that didn't happen overnight. It took several years of adding compost.
Okay, sorry, more questions. Can I use the mentioned Merrifield mix for raised beds?
So these, what I'm talking about, these are soil conditioners. They're to be added to soil that's there. So 100%, yes, you can use that in raised bed, but it's not to be used by itself. You would use that and mix that in with, you still want, when I say soil, some good mineral soil. So you might have topsoil as sort of a main ingredient, and then you might add some soil conditioner or add some bumper crop or add some other ingredients to it. But they're not a substitute for soil.
Okay, so to be mixed into existing soil, not to be used on its own.
But I'm going to tell you, that's an issue that you brought up. It's a little bit of a hot button issue with me. A lot of the raised bed mixes, a lot of the garden soils that are sold don't actually have soil. They're just all different mix of different types of compost. And the problem that we've run into with that, because we've done some gardening here, we've tried it at Garden Center, they tend to dry out fast. They don't have the same kind of water holding capacity. And so you just have to be really vigilant in the watering on it. So me and several colleagues, they've been playing around. They say, you actually need just some dirt, some good old mineral dirt. Clay is not an awful thing. Clay has a lot of nutrients, a lot of nutrient holding capacity, a lot of water holding capacity. Clay is not something to be feared, but it's something I think could be used along with some of these organic conditioners.
That's good to know. Okay, next question. Ooh, we've had a lot come in. Is shredded leaves a good mulch?
Absolutely. All this stuff is good, but what will happen a lot of times is shredded leaves break down very quickly. So if we were talking about earlier, somebody's asking about shredded mulch versus shredded leaves, they can both be utilized, but what would happen is the organic matter, typically, let's say it breaks down about 50% per year. So if I put shredded leaves in there, they will probably decompose and break down in less than a year, 6 to 12 months. They might be gone and have to be replenished. Whereas a bark, it might be 1 or 2 years. So they all works. It depends a little bit what your objective is, what you have available, and what you want to use.
Okay. Next question. You may be addressing this, I'm not sure. So tell me if you want to hold it. How much compost should you be adding to your garden beds?
There's not an exact answer to that. I'm going to say generally this is a time where more is better. When I'm helping customers at the store, I'll usually say I want to put at least a 1-inch layer down, maybe a 2-inch layer, and then cultivate that into the ground. That's not an absolute number. It's just kind of a starting point. You can add more or less depending on your circumstances, the size of the area, budget, that kind of thing. Another way to look at it is like when we process topsoil, if you're ordering bulk topsoil, we're targeting somewhere between 20 and 30%. So it usually is right at about 25% organic compost mixed in with it, but it's not an exact recipe.
Okay.
I'm going to keep going because I just keep talking too much, but I've had a bunch of conversations.
Oh, you're good. We have more and more questions coming in, so we'll hold them.
He was saying that hey, what they will as far as like outside, I was talking with turf grass science, he's saying like 3 to 5%, maybe even 6%. If we start going too high, you get into other issues. It might be like the water holding capacity or getting mushy, not giving you firm footing. So these numbers, I'm just putting all this out. There's not a magic number.
All right. Yeah, if you want to move on, we can hold the rest because we still have about 6 more questions.
Uh, well, let's take a couple more and then I'll go to my fertilizer stuff and I'll be more.
Alrighty. This is one I haven't, this is a new one to me. What is the best way to improve soil in a woodland area with many established trees and lots of roots?
That's a really, really difficult one too. We have a dilemma that because our soil's dense, doesn't hold a lot of oxygen available, a lot of the tree roots come up to the surface, and you'll see this surface rooting because oftentimes most of the root system exists sort of in that top 6, 8 inches. You even look at really old 100-year-old oak trees toppling over. Most of that root system is in the upper layer. Because if I go down 12, 16, 18 inches, our soil here is just, there's no air to breathe. It's not conducive to root health, and everything stays at the surface. So what I'm getting at is, yeah, it's really difficult to go down because I have all the root competition, don't want to injure it. If I start building up and I put soil on top, then I don't want to suffocate the tree. I don't want it to become that soil become a barrier to the tree roots there. Believe you probably heard me say, I've worked for years as an arborist looking at trees on construction sites and everything. And so when I say this, soil compaction is really your enemy. But I think if you take loose topsoil, like we're looking at here, it's not dense, it's compact. You put 1 or 2 inches on top of the trees, we're probably okay at that point. That's going to be my limit on that. If I put excessive amounts above ground, then I risk injuring the trees. I'm limited to how much I can go below ground by the tree roots. So I think the best thing we can do is put an inch or 2, not excessive, maybe just loose topsoil. I'm okay with that around the root zone of existing trees. Within what you can do, I also don't want to injure the roots, but if I can lightly cultivate that in, maybe I end up with a 3-inch kind of planting depth. And oftentimes, that's what we're kind of working with and just trying to find plants that can live and grow within that sort of environment.
Okay, yeah, that sounds like a challenging one. Let's see. Okay, so if you're starting a new garden bed, mostly clay soil, like most of the places in our area, do you have any particular products you recommend that you add? Would that be like the Merrifield planting mix or the bumper crop that you mentioned?
I always like to know how big of an area I'm working with because we
Okay,
look at it in terms of, am I buying it in bulk or am I buying it in bags? That's kind of my,
gotcha. Yeah.
if,
I don't have that information, but please feel free to send it if you know.
but what I'm going to tell you is, to me, the dividing line for us here locally, if you're in our shopping area, of when you get to about 1 cubic yard, that's kind of a dividing point. If you're looking at a cubic yard or more, it's probably going to be more economical for you to buy in bulk. And we sell a couple different types of compost in bulk. If it's going to be cubic yard or less, then you're probably looking at bag products. And then we can talk about the pros and cons within that, but that's kind of where I like to begin my conversation. So in bulk, we have stuff that's just composted leaves, grass, sticks. That's good for a lot of situations. We also sell what's called McGill's Soil Builder. The McGill's is composted yard waste, composted food waste, and it has biosolids in it. The biosolids, which is coming from the treatment plant, increase and boost the nutrient content, but a lot of people are uncomfortable using with it and it can be smelly. So if that doesn't work for you, then we have one that's called Soil Mate. That's just all vegetative stuff. So anyway, we could go on about that forever, but the thing is, kind of figure out how much you need, about how big of an area, and then we can guide you to what your choices are.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, this one's about cow manure. How much cow manure should be added to about 5 cubic yards of leaf, grass, and organic material?
So cow manure, whenever you get manures, cow manure, biosolids, stuff. The good thing is that is more nutrient dense. It has more nitrogen, phosphorus, iron, things like that, which is good. Uh, it would be hard because at least for us, we only have cow manure available in 40-pound bags. So it would be hard to come up with enough cow manure for 5 cubic yards. I guess what I'm saying is of that 5 cubic yards, I would love to see like even 5% of it be cow manure, if you have that available to you. But sometimes it's just a matter of you look at it and say, well, how many bags can I afford, or how many bags can I fit in my car? And that's kind of what we go with. But yeah, so if I had, oh, I can't do the math that quick, 27 cubic feet in the yard, I'm looking at, it might be just off the top of my head, I'm gonna say, I mean, like 20 bags would be just a starting point. You could go higher.
Okay, we just had another question. Is it possible to add too much cow manure?
Uh, so we sell two different kinds of cow manure. There's a composted cow manure and a dehydrated cow manure. The dehydrated, which you figure is like fresh off the farm, has higher nutrient value, but if you overdo it, it does have a potential that could burn or injure the plants. There's enough ammonia in there that if you went real heavy-handed, it could result in plant injury. That's why I prefer and recommend using the composted cow manure, which is aged, because then I don't really have that risk that goes with you. So yeah, that's a risk if you're working with fresh manure. You can overdo it, and it can lead to either. I've had cases where it's happened in my own garden. I was living on a farm, and my landlord helped me out by putting a bunch of fresh manure out of the stables on there, and basically ruined my garden. So I've seen it happen firsthand. But yeah, if you go with the composted product or aged manures, it's a lot safer, I think, that way.
Okay. All right, you want me to keep going or do you want to move
Oh,
on?
that's right. You know what? Let's do this. I'm going to go through my next few slides, and I'll go through them a little faster. It's still good stuff, but then we'll have time to get back to the questions. So all this that we've been talking about have been soil conditioners, right? These are things basically to improve the soil. As I said, feed the soil, and so the soil in return, all right, soil in return helps our plants. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about fertilizers. So we talked about the plants not just needing the support and a good environment for that, but again, they're requiring basically things like oxygen, hydrogen, carbon, water, which they're absorbing from the soil that's in there. But then also there's about 17 essential elements that the plant needs. So plants, they also need, in addition to these organic products, they also need phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, zinc, copper, molybdenum, nickel, the list goes on. So these are all these different nutrients that I'm talking about, and the plant depends on getting these from the soil. So we have divided them into these two categories. When we say macronutrient, these are the ones that the plant needs in the largest volume. This doesn't mean that phosphorus is any more or less than iron. The plant needs iron to grow healthily and properly, and it needs phosphorus to grow properly. But it needs more nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium than the others. The secondary nutrients, magnesium, sulfur, calcium. So again, all these were to refer to the volume of minerals that it needs, but it needs to get these from the soil that's in there. Micronutrients, these are what the plants need it, but in very, very small amounts. So when we talk about fertilizer, what we're really talking about is making sure that we have these essential nutrients in the soil in sufficient quantity and availability the plant can absorb it. If you don't know what minerals exist in your soil, and you don't know if what abundance they're in, the very best way to find out is to have a soil test done. Many of us skip this. I don't want to sound like this is like an essential thing, but it helps to understand what we're doing with fertilizers. So in this case, and you can send samples down to Virginia Tech's soil testing lab. So what they do, if you're an in-state resident, you send them a little box of soil. I forgot to bring it up. It'd be samples about this size. They go down, they do a chemical analysis on it, and you get a report back in here. And what they're telling me, you probably can't see it at home, but this is phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, zinc, molybdenum, copper. Oh, I can't even see that one, getting so small. But, and all these trace elements. So what they're doing in here is they are actually measuring the minerals in your soil. And this report, they're telling me it's high, it's very high, these are sufficient. So essentially telling me that the minerals are there, but they will also, which you can't see in these fine notes, tell you if there's something that's deficient, what you need to add to it to maximize the productivity of the soil. So soil test answers those questions for us. The other part that's really important I want to talk about is the first thing I look at on a soil test. The very first thing I look at is what's my pH. Shows right here. And this sample, and these were just taken about 2 weeks ago, client we were working with, basically its soil came in at 7.1. So the importance of the pH is not just how much of the minerals exist, but are those minerals available, right? So if I was to look at my pH chart, if we look right down here, 7 is neutral. If I go 7 and up, my soil is becoming more alkaline. If I'm going 7 and down, my soil is becoming more acidic. The importance of this is because it determines if those nutrients are readily available to the plant. So A, are the nutrients there? My soil test says, yes, they are there. B, is this in an acceptable pH range where the plant can absorb it? And in the case of that soil test, we're sitting right at about 7.1. The ideal sweet spot, we're saying, hey, is like here between 6 and 6.5. So I'm a little bit elevated, but still okay, good enough. What I want to look at is iron. So look at this mineral, right? Our red clay soil is red because it has iron in it, right? That's oxidized iron that's making it red. As my pH level goes higher and higher, so see, I'm going up here, I'm going up to 7. What's happening is that iron is less and less available. It's in the soil, but the plant's not able to absorb it, right? Classic example that we see. So this is a gardenia. A client had brought it into the plant clinic. This is a little while ago. We're looking at the gardenia, and we want to know why it's looking so yellow and chlorotic that's in there. When I'm looking at it, this particular pattern where we have dark green veins and yellow in between, that is an indication of an iron deficiency. So in this case, it's a micronutrient, right? It's in that small list, but it's vitally important to the plant. And if it's not getting sufficient iron, this is what starts happening to your gardenia in this case. So I'm looking at it, customers fertilizing it, but it's still chlorotic. And I say, well, it's probably the pH of the soil. Well, how do we do that? So this is a little, she went over and we had a little do-it-yourself test kit. Basically, we took the soil from there, ran a test on it, and then you see this sort of dark green color. That's putting me at a high elevated alkaline pH. Back to my chart here. So when my pH is sitting here at 8, it's high level, right? Iron, it's in the soil, but it's immobilized. The plant can't absorb it. So this is kind of like my soil chemistry stuff. So we need to make sure that the minerals are there and that the pH allows them to be available to the plant. Those are our 2 critical things that we look at. So most of us are not going to go through all that trouble. Understandable, but it's, hey, if you do, it's only $10. It takes about a week to get the results back. It's a very good investment to do that. And then you know the soil and you can make better informed decisions. What we do is we package fertilizers, we custom blend them for different uses in our region based on our general knowledge that happens. So when you look at a bag of fertilizer, in this case, right, it says 26. That's one of those macronutrients. This bag is 26% nitrogen. The middle number, phosphorus, that's another one of those macronutrients. This one, it's a 0 because this was actually a water quality situation. This is all regulated through the state and local jurisdictions. Because of our existence in the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area and trying to restore the Chesapeake Bay, and because most of our soils are high in phosphorus, in the case of lawns and lawn care throughout DC, Maryland, Virginia, we put 0 phosphate because we really don't want phosphate to end up in the water. This 12, again, 12% potassium that's in there, another of the plant macronutrients. So when you look at a fertilizer, you're always going to see these 3 numbers. They're always representative of 3 of these key macronutrients that are in there. The numbers will change based on the specific use, what I'm growing and what your soil conditions are. So in this case, right now I have 18% phosphate in the middle. The phosphate's a plant essential nutrient, and it's especially important in the energy transport system of plants. So I'm a young seedling and I'm sprouting and I've got roots going into the soil and a lot of cell division taking place. We know that this additional phosphate aids in the establishment and rooting of that new seed. So for this example, today we have basically the Select, which has 18% phosphate for seeding lawns, establishing lawns, 0% phosphate for lawns that are well established and I'm not seeding. So they always have these 3 numbers, and this is what causes confusion when we look at it. We also have like a tree and shrub food. We put a high nitrogen rate. This tends to improve the vegetative leafy growth that might be on shade trees or evergreens, for example. And then we go lower in this phosphorus. Here, the flowering plant food, I go high in phosphorus, try to promote better flowering and blooms, lower in the nitrogen. So this is like the confusing part of fertilizers. We try to make it easy and just say, look, if I want green leafy growth, we're going to put this one on. If I want flowers, we're going to put this one on. So we try to do a lot of homework, a lot of this preparation for you. I'm going to get back to questions. We looked at all these pictures of dirt and soil and bags and chemistry. I just wanted to finish up with something pretty. That's why I put the Virginia bluebells in there. I think some people, early areas might start to see them bloom, but really it's probably over the next couple of weeks they'll kick in. So again, this is just our native environment that's there. This would be a good example we call alluvial soils. These are soils that were formed and transported, developed, and influenced by water. So it was the stream valley that built this soil, rich in organic matter, moist, and the ideal environment for growing bluebells. But that's how soil influences plants. Let's go back to our questions.
All righty. Please feel free to send in any more questions. We'll go as long as we can, well, until 3 o'clock. We'll go for 11 minutes. Next question. This is back to the raised beds, I think. What is the best combination if you're trying to grow vegetables in raised beds? Because you were mentioning that the raised bed mix dries out quickly. So what would you combine for that?
So I'm going to tell you this, like you've heard me say all the time, my disclaimer, this is like cooking.
Yes.
Everybody has their own recipe, and I'm not saying what's right or wrong. What I have found works well in my experience is if I was getting, for example, our bulk topsoil, if let's say this is it's 1 cubic yard or larger size of raised bed, I'd be putting let's say if I put a cubic yard of topsoil in there, that already has been amended with some aged composted yard waste that's in there. And then in addition to that, let's say I fill my bed up with that topsoil, and then I put maybe a 2 or 3 inch layer of bumper crop in there. Stir that in together, and I think with that, we've got a pretty good mix. So
Okay.
that's just an idea. There's many other recipes out there.
Yes. All right, next question. I'm laughing because this is something that I do. So, rather than toss out used potting soil, can I amend it with compost? What is a good ratio?
What I do, and you should reuse it, I like to reuse potting mix for at least 3 years, and then maybe after about 3 years, I'll toss it and start over. It's just too expensive and too valuable to throw it out. So what, again, I often find I do myself, I mean, and I'm glad you asked this, when I'm growing in pots and containers, what I found works well with me is I use our Merrifield potting mix and I use bumper crop, and I'll mix those about 50-50. And I've had really good results on that. What will end up happening is next year, let's say I pull the old plants out, you know, the root balls and stuff goes into the compost, and I need to refresh the top 2 or 3 inches. And again, that can be either just refresh where I add more of this potting mix bumper crop combination, stir that in, bring it back to the correct levels, and we're good to go.
That's what I do. That's it. Since I live in a condo, either I or my husband have to drag the potting soil through the parking garage, up the elevator, and through the house. So we replace as little as possible.
Right, because when
Um,
you're growing in pots, the drainage is really critical, and so pots, that's why I'm saying we do use a potting mix that may have things like perlite in it and some bark and things to enhance the drainage, and then I'll kind of boost that or refresh it with some bumper crop. But yeah, I do the Merrifield potting mix and bumper crop combination.
Perfect. Next question. I live in a newly constructed home and the soil is horrific. We ripped out all the original planting. We've added compost, mulch, coir, perlite. Do you have any other suggestions?
Uh, that all sounds really good. Again, I'm just, you know, I'm going to say, like, if you want to toss in some other types of compost, which could be, you know, our planting mix, or again, the bumper crop, and we have several others, that's all fine. What will happen is, and I didn't talk about this too much, I think when it's a brand new bed and crummy construction soil, you want to dig this soil, you want to cultivate that, you want to bury and mix and stir as much of this organic matter into the soil at the time of planting. Uh, After you've done that, we don't really want to keep disturbing the soil. We want it to take time for all those microbes, and they'll start to digest it. Eventually, start finding earthworms. They're building and improving the soil. But in subsequent years, I want to replenish it with just, I'll often layer in there, I'm going to say basically a compost of your choice. You know, I make my own compost. I use that. If I'm running short, I use bumper crop. You know, you use, if you need it in really big volumes and you want to go get it from the municipal place where they have free compost, a little bit of a take your own risk, but you use what you have. Just get organic matter, get compost in there.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, this is referring to what you were talking about, the tree roots and the soil above the tree roots. My neighbor blows all of his leaves into his woods and his dead grass, and there's a layer of a foot or so of materials over his tree roots. Is that harmful?
No, I mean, that's a little bit excessive, but I'm going to say in a natural environment, of course, that's what we see. The trees shed their leaves, the leaves feed the soil, and that's the way nature is supposed to work. Grass clippings and leaves, it's mostly air. They decompose so readily. Even if I get a deep layer like you're talking about, it's not going to suffocate or interfere. It's loose enough, it's porous enough. It does allow air and water to get through and it will compost down. Where we get real problems is when we start adding soil, when people are regrading or construction projects and they start adding soil over top. And then what gets really bad is then we also start running equipment in there and compacts it down. Now I've created a condition where the air and water is not getting to the roots and the trees will go into its steady decline.
Sorry, I had to mute. My dog was barking. You may have addressed this a bit with the soil nutrients and the acidity versus alkaline. can you discuss the value of adding lime to the soil in a little bit more detail?
Right, so look, I came prepared for that question. So let's say we discover that our soil is very acidic and needs to be improved. So it's not unusual. I'm gonna use lawn as an example. Lawn wants to be somewhere between 6.2 and 6.8. And I guess soil testing, it's down in the range of 5. So then there are steps we take to elevate the pH of the soil, make it less acidic. And that's where lime comes into the picture. So lime, again, it's natural material, it's calcium carbonate, but we add lime to there. And it's a gradual process. Again, this stuff doesn't happen instantly. So the amount you use, again, soil tests are really helpful. That's in there. You get into this thing, there's all different types of lime. The one that I'm going to recommend to you is going to be a pelletized lime, because pelletized lime has the least amount of dust. It's the easiest to use. And if we're trying to correct the soil pH, we'll put it on 50 pounds per 1,000 square feet. But the actual amount that you use is going to be based on what your actual pH is and what the target is. So we're going to use lime to raise the pH. If I want to go the other way, let's say I'm going to make the soil, I find I have it elevated, let's pretend. So that soil test that you saw for lawns, it was 7.1. If I want to grow blueberries there, blueberries to perform much better when they have a pH that's down, let's say in the 5s. So that's where I would use sulfur. So sulfur can be used to make the pH lower. So we can adjust that, but I will not recommend these products unless I have a soil test and know where I'm starting and where I'm going. I deal with that all the time. That's something I'm rigid on. If I don't know what the pH is, I don't make recommendations regarding lime. It should not be applied habitually. A lot of people do it, say, well, I haven't done it in 3 years, my neighbor does it, or I read about it. I've looked at thousands of soil tests over the time. You don't know. You just really need to do a pH test and then follow those recommendations.
Okay, this actually leads perfectly into our next question, which is about blueberries. If you're planting an acid-loving plant in a pot or container like low bush blueberries, what's the best way to get the pH in the correct range? Would you use that product or would you use something different?
So there are some specialty fertilizers. So if I say, for example, the people make like Hollytone or Berrytone, those are fertilizers that contain sulfur. The sulfur is mixed into the fertilizer, and so they will lower the pH of the soil for you. I've seen some specialty potting mixes that are for acid-loving plants, but that's pretty specialized and not always readily available. So yeah, I think you should assume that the potting mix that you're buying is pH adjusted to fairly neutral. That's kind of an industry standard. If I'm putting blueberries, blueberries, azaleas, rhododendrons, parasiticide, these are acid-loving plants, then I would put an acidifying fertilizer, mix that right in with the potting mix at the time of planting.
Okay, perfect. All right, this is our last question. And perfect, because we have 2 minutes left. Okay. I have coral bells that are leggy and they appear to be growing out of the soil. So it sounds like the plant maybe is too high above the soil. When that happens, do you dig up and replant or can you add more dirt and compost over the top? It's a little bit like the tree roots issue.
Well, we're gonna find out together, because I did it over the years. It's like you get sometimes plant people call a long neck on there year after year. It's like that crown raises up and up. What I've got some old coral bells, and what I've always done is like you suggest. I've just always thrown a little more compost or soil over that neck. That rhizome, it kind of roots back in, and that works perfectly fine. I know that because I've done it over the years. This year, it just got so, it's a really old plant, so extended. I hope this works. I don't know. I just cut it off and decide, well, live or die. Either way, because I got to the point where I wasn't happy with it. I thought, okay, we're going to either we're just going to cut off. It's going to resprout and be all thick and bushy and close to the ground. I could have taken that top part and rerouted it and started another plant, but I'm lazy and If it doesn't work, I'll just go buy a new one.
So
So,
you
yeah,
can put the soil over the top. It's fine. At some point, though, it may just not be worth it.
right,
Just
exactly, your
so
choice.
we'll see if it lives. All right. That's great. Well, that's the last question, and it is 3 o'clock on the dot. So, David, actually, quick note: anybody, if you have questions that come up later, please feel free to email. You can hit reply on those Eventbrite emails, and that comes to me. David, do you have anything you would like to wrap up with before we close?
Just super quick, because we've talked about so many different things. I always say, and you've heard me say it 1,000 times, I'll say it 1,000 more. So think of a fertilizer as taking a vitamin pill. We're putting nutrients, plant essential nutrients in the ground. It's not a medicine, it's not a cure, it doesn't fix pest problems, it doesn't make up for poor watering practices, but it's like taking a vitamin pill that you or I may do in our diet. A soil conditioner, of which is where we're actually putting organic matter, bulk, putting organic material in soil, providing carbon, feeding the soil. They work together, but think of them as two different things. And that, I think I'll call quits right there.
All righty. Well, thank you so much, David. Everybody, again, please feel free to call the store, stop by, send us an email if you have any questions come up, and we will see you next time. Have a good afternoon.